Every parent's worst nightmare is losing their spouse and having to raise their children alone. But imagine being thrown out of your home by your own family just weeks after burying your wife. That's exactly what happened to David Mitchell. Standing in the rain with his 10-year-old twins, Emma and Jake, he watched his wealthy in-laws pack their few belongings into boxes. "You never belonged here anyway," his mother-in-law said coldly. David had nowhere to go except a run-down house on the wrong side of town. He worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table while his children asked when they could go home. What David didn't know was that his late wife Sarah had left him something that would change everything. A lawyer was searching for him with news about a $200 million inheritance. But would this money heal the pain of rejection or teach him what family really means? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Mitchell had never thought much about money until he didn't have any. Sitting on the front porch of the house on Elm Street, watching paint peel from the shutters in long, deliberate strips, he turned Sarah's wedding ring over and over between his fingers. The simple gold band caught the afternoon light, reflecting memories of a time when love seemed like enough to conquer anything. They had met at the university library during his graduate studies in history. Sarah was tucked into a corner carrel, surrounded by art books and sketching something in the margins of her notebook. Her blonde hair fell like a curtain across her face, and when she looked up at his approach, her green eyes held a warmth that made him forget whatever clever opening line he'd prepared. "You're in my usual spot," she said, but she was smiling. "I can move," he offered, already reaching for his books. "Or you could sit here and tell me why you're carrying around a biography of Theodore Roosevelt at 9 o'clock on a Friday night." That was Sarah, direct but never harsh, curious about everything and everyone. She came from the kind of family that appeared in the society pages of the newspaper, but she wore faded jeans and paint-stained sweaters to class. Her father, Charles Whitmore, owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Her mother, Margaret, traced her lineage back to railroad barons and spoke in the clipped tones of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. David's family ran a small hardware store in a neighboring town. His father worked with his hands, knew the names of every customer, and believed that a man's worth was measured by his integrity rather than his bank account. When David brought Sarah home for the first time, his parents welcomed her with the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. When Sarah brought David to meet the Whitmores, the reception was decidedly cooler. "Teaching is a noble profession," Charles had said during that first dinner, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "Of course, private schools pay considerably more than public ones. David wants to make a difference in the community," Sarah had replied, her hand finding his under the table. "He believes education should be accessible to everyone." Margaret had smiled tightly. How idealistic. Despite their disapproval, Sarah had chosen David. They were married in a small ceremony at her family's estate, though Margaret made it clear she would have preferred something grander. Sarah wore her grandmother's dress not because she couldn't afford something new, but because she loved the story behind it. Her grandmother had eloped during the Depression, choosing love over social expectations. "She was my inspiration," Sarah told David on their wedding night, sitting on the edge of their modest apartment's bed. "She taught me that real wealth has nothing to do with money." The twins arrived 2 years later, Emma with Sarah's artistic soul and thoughtful nature, Jake with David's determination and protective instincts. They lived simply but happily in a small house near the school where David taught. Sarah worked part-time at a local art gallery, more for the joy of it than from necessity. She had access to her trust fund, but they rarely touched it except for emergencies. "I want the children to understand the value of things," she would say, when David suggested they could afford something nicer. "I don't want them to grow up thinking money solves everything." The Whitmores visited occasionally, always with subtle criticism, disguised as concern. The house was too small. The neighborhood wasn't prestigious enough. David's salary was insufficient for raising their grandchildren properly. Sarah deflected their comments with grace, but David could see the strain it caused her. When the twins were 8, Sarah found the lump. She said nothing for weeks, hoping it would disappear, but David noticed her distraction during their evening walks. He noticed how she held her left arm differently, how she paused longer than usual when climbing stairs. "It's probably nothing," she said when she finally told him about the doctor's appointment. It wasn't nothing. The diagnosis was aggressive breast cancer, and despite the best medical care money could buy, the prognosis was grim. Sarah faced the treatments with the same quiet courage she brought to everything else. She made instructions for David about the children's routines, their likes and dislikes, their fears and dreams. "Emma needs time to process emotions," she wrote in her careful handwriting. "She'll want to draw about it before she can talk about it. Jake will try to take care of everyone else. Don't let him carry too much responsibility." During those long months of chemotherapy and radiation, the Whitmores made their opinions clear. They wanted Sarah to come home to the estate where she could be properly cared for. They wanted the children to attend private school. They wanted David to accept a position at Charles's company, something with more security and prestige. "They mean well," Sarah said after a particularly tense visit from her mother. "Do they?" David asked gently. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the small garden she had planted when they first moved in. "I think they're afraid," she finally said. "Afraid that when I'm gone, they'll lose the children too." "They won't lose them. We're family." Sarah looked at him then, and something flickered in her expression, a sadness he couldn't quite interpret. "Promise me something, David. Promise me you'll remember that you're enough. Just as you are, you're enough." He promised, though he didn't understand why she seemed so worried about it. Sarah's health declined rapidly in the final months. She spent hours in her study, writing letters and making phone calls she wouldn't discuss. David assumed she was handling her financial affairs, ensuring the children's education funds were properly managed. He was focused on being present for every moment they had left, treasuring the quiet conversations and gentle touches that would soon be memories. The day she died, holding his hand while the twins slept curled against her hospital bed, Sarah's last words were about the children. "Take care of them. Help them remember that love is the only thing that lasts." The funeral was held at the Whitmore family church, a grand stone building where Sarah had been baptized as an infant. Margaret took charge of the arrangements, organizing a service that reflected the family's social standing more than Sarah's humble nature. David sat in the front pew with Emma and Jake, watching colleagues and acquaintances file past the ornate casket, and felt utterly alone despite the crowd. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmores began their campaign of gentle pressure. They visited daily, bringing elaborate meals the children barely touched, and suggestions about practical arrangements. The house was too full of memories. The children needed stability. David needed support, raising them alone. "We're family," Margaret would say, her hand resting possessively on Emma's shoulder. "We want what's best for everyone." David tried to be gracious. They were grieving too, and he understood their desire to feel useful. But their version of help felt increasingly like control. They criticized his parenting choices, his financial decisions, his plans for the children's future. When he mentioned enrolling the twins in public middle school, Charles made calls to private institutions without consulting him. "We can afford to give them advantages," Margaret argued when David protested. Sarah would have wanted that. "Sarah wanted them to have a normal childhood," David replied. "She said so many times." "Sarah was sick," Margaret said, her voice gentling in a way that felt condescending. She wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. That night, David found Sarah's journal in her desk drawer. Her handwriting grew shakier as the entries progressed, but her thoughts remained clear and purposeful. She wrote about her love for him, her hopes for the children, and her growing concern about her parents' intentions. "They see David as temporary," she had written just weeks before her death. "They think grief will make him more pliable, more willing to accept their version of what's best. They don't understand that his strength comes from his principles, not his circumstances." I pray he remembers who he is when they try to change him." Reading those words, David felt Sarah's presence as clearly as if she were sitting beside him. She had known this would happen. She had tried to prepare him, but he had been too focused on losing her to hear the warning. The final confrontation came on a grey October morning, 6 weeks after the funeral. David was making breakfast when he heard the moving truck in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, he watched Margaret directing workers toward the house. "What's happening?" Emma asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "I don't know, sweetheart," David said, but his heart was already sinking. Margaret entered without knocking, her expression set with the kind of determination David had learned to fear. "We've made arrangements," she announced. "The children will be more comfortable at the estate, and you'll have time to figure out your next steps." "My next steps? You can't raise them properly on a teacher's salary," Charles said, following his wife into the kitchen. "Sarah's gone, David. The practical realities haven't changed just because we're all grieving." Emma began to cry quietly, and Jake moved protectively to his sister's side. David knelt to their level, his hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Go pack some clothes," he said softly. "We're going to stay somewhere else for a while." "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice rising. "This isn't a request. The house belongs to the family trust. Sarah lived here at our discretion, and that arrangement died with her." The words hit David like a physical blow. In all their years together, Sarah had never mentioned that the house wasn't truly theirs. She had paid the bills, handled the finances, protected him from the details that would have made him feel like a charity case. "1 week," Charles said, not unkindly but with the finality of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That should be enough time to find somewhere appropriate." They left David alone with the twins and the workers, who began systematically packing their lives into boxes. Emma sat on her bed, drawing furiously in her sketchbook while tears ran down her cheeks. Jake helped pack with the mechanical efficiency of someone in shock. "Are we going to live with Grandma and Grandpa?" Emma asked. David looked at his daughter's hopeful face and felt something break inside him. "No, sweetheart. We're going to find our own place." "But where?" He didn't have an answer. Sarah's death had left him unprepared for practical challenges that seemed insurmountable. His teacher's salary could cover rent and basic expenses, but he had no savings for deposits or moving costs. The life insurance policy would help, but it was tied up in probate. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had brought casseroles and quiet comfort during Sarah's illness, appeared in the doorway with a thermos of coffee and an envelope. "There's a house on Elm Street," she said without preamble. "The owner's looking for someone responsible to rent it cheap in exchange for fixing it up. It's not much, but it's got good bones and a big yard for the children." The envelope contained a key and an address. David stared at the offering, overwhelmed by the kindness of someone who barely knew him. "Why would you do this?" he asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled, her weathered face creasing with warmth. "Because sometimes the only family that matters is the one that chooses to love you." As the moving truck pulled away from the house where his children had taken their first steps and lost their first teeth, David made a silent promise to Sarah. He would prove that her faith in him hadn't been misplaced. He would show the twins that a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account or his social connections. He would teach them that love, indeed, was the only thing that lasted. The house on Elm Street stood before them like a question mark, weathered, uncertain, but full of possibility. David gathered his children close and turned Sarah's ring one more time before slipping it into his pocket. They were home. The eviction notice arrived on official letterhead, delivered by a courier who waited while David signed for it with trembling hands. The formal language couldn't disguise the message. They had 72 hours to vacate the premises. David stared at the document in the grey morning light, coffee growing cold in his cup. 6 weeks since Sarah's funeral, and the Whitmores had made their move. The notice cited breach of residency agreement and failure to maintain property standards, legal fiction, designed to provide cover for what was essentially a family coup. "Daddy?" Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed rabbit Sarah had given her for her 8th birthday. "Why are there men outside?" Through the window, David could see the moving truck parked in their driveway like a patient predator. 2 workers sat in the cab, waiting for instructions. Margaret Whitmore stood on the front lawn in her wool coat, checking her watch with the precision of a general coordinating an invasion. "We're going to be moving," David said carefully, kneeling to Emma's level. "Remember how we talked about adventures?" Emma's green eyes, so much like her mother's, filled with uncertainty. "But Mama's things are here, her paints and her books and her garden." The garden. Sarah had spent countless hours nurturing the small plot behind the house, teaching the twins to plant seeds and tend seedlings. Emma had helped her choose the flowers, while Jake had been fascinated by the vegetables. It was where Sarah had felt strongest during her illness, drawing energy from the earth and sunshine. Jake appeared beside his sister, already dressed and alert. At 10, he possessed a protective instinct that sometimes worried David. The boy had appointed himself guardian of the family's remaining pieces, counting and recounting their possessions as if vigilance alone could keep them safe. "How long do we have?" Jake asked, his voice steady but his hands clenched into small fists. Before David could answer, the front door opened without ceremony. Margaret entered with the authority of ownership, followed by Charles and 2 men in expensive suits David didn't recognize. "Good morning," Margaret said, her tone suggesting this was anything but good. "I trust you received the notice. We've arranged for a moving service to help with the transition." "You can't just throw us out," David said, rising to his full height. The eviction notice crinkled in his grip. "This is our home. This house belongs to the Whitmore Family Trust," Charles replied, consulting a folder thick with legal documents. Sarah had usage rights during her lifetime, but those rights weren't transferable. Surely you understood that. David hadn't understood that at all. Sarah had handled their finances, paid the utilities, dealt with maintenance issues. She had protected him from feeling like a dependent, and in doing so, had left him vulnerable to this moment. "Where are we supposed to go?" Emma whispered. Margaret's expression softened fractionally as she looked at her granddaughter. "Darling, you and Jake will come home with us. Grandfather has already arranged enrollment at Whitfield Academy, and your rooms are waiting at the estate." "What about Daddy?" Jake demanded, stepping closer to David's side. "Your father needs time to make proper arrangements for his future," Margaret said carefully. "He'll visit, of course, but—" "No." The word came out sharper than David intended, startling everyone in the room. "We stay together. That's not negotiable." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand this is emotional, but you need to consider what's practical. The children have substantial trust funds that will ensure their education and security. You want what's best for them." "I am what's best for them," David said quietly. "I'm their father." Charles stepped forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man accustomed to getting his way through patience rather than force. "David, be realistic. You can't provide for them the way we can. Private schools, college funds, cultural opportunities. None of that matters if they lose their family," David interrupted. "We are their family," Margaret said, her composure cracking slightly. "We're their blood. You're just what?" David's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Margaret caught herself, but the damage was done. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Emma began to cry, not the dramatic sobbing of a child seeking attention, but the quiet, heartbroken weeping of someone who understood that the adults had failed her. Jake put his arm around his sister, his jaw set with determination. "We're not going anywhere without Dad. Now see here, young man," Charles began. "No," Jake said, his voice carrying more authority than a 10-year-old should possess. "Mom told us that families stick together no matter what. She said that's what makes them families." David felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Sarah's values lived on in their children, stronger than any legal document or financial pressure. "Very well," Margaret said, her mask of concern slipping to reveal something colder underneath. If that's your choice, you have until tomorrow evening to collect your personal belongings and leave. And go where? David asked. Margaret shrugged with studied indifference. That's hardly our concern anymore. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of packing and desperate phone calls. David contacted every rental agency in the city, but his teacher's salary and lack of security deposit eliminated most options. The few properties he could afford were either unsafe or unavailable immediately. Mrs. Patterson appeared at intervals with sandwiches and quiet support. She helped Emma pack her art supplies while David wrestled with the larger furniture. Jake appointed himself inventory manager, creating careful lists of what they were taking and what they were leaving behind. "Will we ever come back?" Emma asked, as they loaded the last boxes into David's aging sedan. David looked at the house where his children had learned to walk, where he and Sarah had dreamed about their future, where love had been the only currency that mattered. The garden was already showing signs of neglect, the late-season flowers drooping without Sarah's careful attention. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said honestly, "but wherever we go, we'll be together." The house on Elm Street looked like hope that had been abandoned and left to weather. The paint was peeling, the front steps sagged, and several windows were covered with plywood. But it had a roof, 4 walls, and rent David could manage if he was careful. Mrs. Patterson had driven them there in her ancient Buick, having insisted they needed a proper escort to their new home. She produced a key from her purse with the ceremony of a fairy godmother dispensing magic. "The owner's been looking for the right tenant," she explained as they stood on the cracked sidewalk. "Someone who'll see the potential instead of just the problems." Inside, the house smelled of dust and abandonment. The rooms were larger than David had expected, with high ceilings and hardwood floors hidden beneath years of neglect. Emma walked through the empty spaces like a small ghost, her footsteps echoing in the silence. "It needs work," Jake observed, with the practicality he'd inherited from both parents. "It needs love," David corrected, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "And we've got plenty of that." They spent their first night on air mattresses in the living room, sharing a pizza Mrs. Patterson had insisted on buying. By lamplight, the room looked less forbidding, the shadows softer, the possibilities more apparent. "Tell us about when you and Mama first moved in together," Emma requested, snuggling against David's side. So David told them about the tiny apartment near the university, how they'd furnished it with hand-me-downs and yard sale finds, how Sarah had painted murals on the walls to make it feel like home. He told them about the first dinner party they'd hosted, serving spaghetti on mismatched plates to friends who became family. "Were you scared?" Jake asked. "Terrified," David admitted, "but scared in a good way, like standing at the edge of something wonderful." Emma considered this seriously. "Are we scared? In a good way now?" David looked around the empty room, at his children's faces illuminated by the warm glow of the lamp, and felt something shift inside him. The eviction notice had been meant to break him, to force him to surrender his children to a life he couldn't provide. Instead, it had freed him from the weight of other people's expectations. "Yes," he said, pulling them closer, "I think we are." Outside, the wind rattled the old windows, but inside their circle of light, the Mitchell family began the work of building a new home from nothing but love and determination. 3 months into their new life, David discovered that poverty was less about not having money and more about the constant mental mathematics of survival. He could tell you the exact cost of a gallon of milk at 3 different stores, knew which day the bakery marked down day-old bread, and had memorized the bus schedule that would get him to all 3 of his jobs, with minimal transfers. Mornings began at 5:30, with substitute teaching at Roosevelt Elementary. Afternoons found him on construction sites, learning to frame walls and install drywall with hands that had grown calloused and strong. Evenings were reserved for tutoring high school students in their affluent homes, where he sat at kitchen islands that cost more than his monthly rent and helped teenagers understand the historical significance of events that suddenly felt very personal. The teaching award from his previous school sat propped against the windowsill in his makeshift home office, a dusty corner of the living room, where he graded papers by lamplight. The bronze plaque read, "David Mitchell, Excellence in Education, 2019. Sometimes, when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he would look at those words and remember who he had been before grief and circumstance had redefined his life. Emma and Jake adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that children possess but shouldn't need to use. They enrolled at Jefferson Middle School, a public institution that bore no resemblance to the private academies the Whitmores had preferred. The building was older, the resources limited, but the teachers cared deeply about their students' success. Emma struggled most with the transition. She had inherited Sarah's sensitive nature along with her artistic talent, and the chaos of their new reality manifested in her drawings. Where she had once sketched flowers and family portraits, her recent work featured dark, swirling storms and houses that looked perpetually on the verge of collapse. "She's processing," explained Mrs. Chen, the school counselor, when David came for a conference. "Children often express their emotions through art before they can verbalize them. The important thing is that she's still creating." Jake, meanwhile, had appointed himself the family's unofficial guardian. He walked Emma to her classes, helped her carry her art supplies, and deflected questions from curious classmates about why they had moved. At home, he insisted on helping with dinner preparation and household chores, his small face serious with self-imposed responsibility. "You don't have to take care of everything," David told him one evening as they repaired a loose floorboard together. "Mom said families help each other," Jake replied, not looking up from the hammer he was wielding with careful precision. "This is how I help." Their new neighborhood was a study in contrasts. Some houses were well maintained, with tidy yards and fresh paint. Others, like theirs, showed the accumulated wear of deferred maintenance and economic struggle. But there was a sense of community here that had been absent from their previous life. Neighbors who checked on each other, children who played in the streets without scheduled supervision, families who understood that wealth wasn't measured solely in dollars. Mrs. Patterson lived 2 blocks away and had become their unofficial grandmother. She appeared regularly with casseroles, practical advice, and stories about surviving the depression that put their current challenges into perspective. "People think poverty is about lacking things," she told David, as they watched the twins play in the backyard. "But it's really about lacking choices. The trick is making sure your children understand the difference." The house itself was slowly yielding to their efforts. David had discovered a talent for renovation that surprised him. Weekends were devoted to painting walls, fixing leaky faucets, and coaxing life back into rooms that had been neglected for too long. Emma chose colors for her bedroom, soft blues and greens that reminded her of her mother's garden. Jake preferred practical improvements, better lighting for homework, shelves for his books, a workspace where he could build the model airplanes that had become his latest passion. Their first small victory came when David managed to repair the front steps. He had salvaged lumber from a construction site and spent an entire Saturday measuring, cutting, and hammering. When he finished, the steps were level and sturdy, a small improvement that felt monumental. "They look like real steps now," Emma observed, testing them carefully. "They are real steps," David replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Built to last." That evening, as they sat on their newly repaired front porch, eating ice cream cones Mrs. Patterson had brought over, David felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: contentment. Not happiness, exactly, that seemed too ambitious, but a quiet sense of accomplishment. The financial pressure was constant but manageable. David's 3 jobs provided enough income to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and basic necessities. There was no money for extras, no family vacations, restaurant meals, or new clothes unless absolutely necessary. But they weren't hungry, and they weren't homeless, and some days that felt like prosperity. Emma's teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, called one afternoon to discuss her daughter's progress. "She's incredibly talented," she said, "but I'm concerned about some of her recent work. There's a sadness there that goes beyond normal childhood experiences." David arranged to meet with Ms. Rodriguez after school. She showed him Emma's portfolio, dozens of drawings that chronicled their family's journey from loss to displacement to tentative rebuilding. The progression was remarkable. Early pieces were chaotic and dark, but recent work showed emerging signs of hope. A house with strong foundations, a family of 3 figures holding hands against a backdrop of storms. "She's working through her grief," Ms. Rodriguez explained. "Art is her way of making sense of change. But she might benefit from the after-school art program we're starting. It's free, and it would give her more time to develop her skills." David hesitated. The program ran until 6 o'clock, which would mean Emma taking the bus home alone or waiting for him to finish his construction job. But the opportunity was too valuable to pass up. "We'll make it work," he decided. That night, when he told Emma about the art program, her face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen in months. "Really? With real supplies and everything?" "Really? Ms. Rodriguez says you have exceptional talent." Emma hugged him fiercely, and for a moment, David felt rich beyond measure. Jake's adjustment had been quieter but no less significant. His protective instincts had sharpened, but so had his sense of justice. When a classmate made fun of Emma's thrift store clothes, Jake had stood up to him with words rather than fists, a maturity that impressed his teachers and worried his father in equal measure. "He's carrying too much responsibility for his age," David confided to Mrs. Patterson during one of her visits. "Maybe," she replied, watching Jake help Emma with her homework at the kitchen table. "Or maybe he's learning what real strength looks like." Sometimes, children surprise us with how much they can handle when they know they're loved. As autumn settled over their neighborhood, the house on Elm Street began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. David had planted a small garden in the backyard, nothing as elaborate as Sarah's, but enough to provide fresh vegetables and give the children a connection to the earth their mother had loved. The teaching award caught the evening light from its place on the windowsill, its bronze surface reflecting the warm glow of their simple living room. David looked at it and realized that excellence in education wasn't just about curriculum and test scores. It was about teaching his children that their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances, that family was built through love and commitment rather than wealth and status. They were learning those lessons together, one repaired step at a time. 6 months after moving to Elm Street, David found Emma's art supplies hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. The wooden box was lacquered mahogany, expensive and elegant, with Emma Claire Mitchell engraved on a small brass plate. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted compartments, were professional-grade watercolors, charcoal pencils, and brushes that cost more than David spent on groceries in a week. "Mum bought them for me," Emma explained when he asked, her voice small with worry. "She said they were for when I was ready to create something important. I was saving them." David lifted out a tube of ultramarine blue, feeling its weight and quality. Sarah had chosen each item carefully, investing in tools that would last a lifetime. The gesture was so typical of his wife, planning for a future she wouldn't see, ensuring their daughter would have what she needed to pursue her dreams. "I think you're ready now," he said gently. "Mom would want you to use them." That afternoon, Emma set up her easel in the backyard and began to paint. Her first piece was tentative, a simple landscape of their street, with its modest houses and towering oak trees. But as the days passed, her confidence grew. She painted their house before and after David's renovations, capturing the transformation from neglect to care. She painted Jake building a birdhouse, his tongue poking out in concentration. She painted David, reading on the front porch, looking peaceful in a way that surprised him. The art supplies became a bridge between Emma's past and present, a tangible reminder that some gifts transcended loss. When she worked with them, she spoke to her mother, quiet conversations about color choices and composition that David pretended not to overhear. Jake's adaptation had taken a different form. He had discovered the neighborhood's informal network of boys who traded baseball cards, built tree forts, and engaged in elaborate games of capture the flag that spanned multiple yards. For the first time since Sarah's death, he was acting like a typical 10-year-old rather than a miniature adult. David watched from the kitchen window as Jake played catch with Tommy Rodriguez, Mrs. Rodriguez's grandson, who lived 3 houses down. The boys' laughter carried on the evening air, a sound David had worried he might never hear again. "He's making friends," Mrs. Patterson observed, joining David at the window with 2 cups of coffee. She had taken to stopping by most evenings, ostensibly to check on their progress, but really because she enjoyed their company as much as they enjoyed hers. "I was starting to worry he'd forgotten how to be a kid," David admitted. "Children are resilient, but they need permission to heal," she replied. "Sounds like you're all giving each other that permission." The phone had been ringing with increasing frequency, always the same number, always during dinner or homework time. David had stopped answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize, assuming they were telemarketers or debt collectors. His financial situation was precarious but stable. He didn't need reminders about bills he was already struggling to pay. But the calls persisted with a determination that eventually wore down his resistance. On a particularly exhausting Tuesday, after Jake had asked 3 times why the phone kept ringing, David finally answered, "Mr. Mitchell, this is Robert Harrison from Harrison, Walsh and Associates. I've been trying to reach you regarding your late wife's estate." David's first instinct was suspicion. Sarah's will had been simple. She had left everything to him and the children, though everything had amounted to modest savings and personal belongings. The Whitmores had made it clear that any family money was tied up in trusts and foundations he had no access to. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," David said, starting to hang up. "Mr. Mitchell, please, this concerns a trust established by your wife that you may not be aware of. I represent the Meridian Foundation, and there are legal matters that require your immediate attention." Something in the lawyer's tone made David pause. "What kind of legal matters? I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Are you available to meet tomorrow?" David looked around their small kitchen, where Emma was working on homework at the table they'd rescued from a thrift store, and Jake was building a model plane on the counter. Their life was finally finding its rhythm. The last thing he needed was legal complications that might threaten their stability. "I can't afford a lawyer," he said bluntly. "Mr. Mitchell, you don't understand. You're not being sued. There's money involved, a substantial amount, but I need to verify your identity and discuss the terms of the trust. Could we meet at my office tomorrow at 10? David agreed, though he spent the night wondering what Sarah might have set in motion without telling him. They had shared everything, or so he had believed. But her journal had revealed depths of planning and foresight he hadn't suspected. Perhaps there were other secrets waiting to be discovered. The law offices of Harrison, Walsh and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown building. David remembered from his courting days with Sarah. He had proposed to her in the park across the street, certain that love was all they needed to build a life together. The irony wasn't lost on him as he stood in the marble lobby, checking his appearance in the elevator's polished doors. His clothes were clean, but clearly budget-conscious khakis with a carefully mended tear. A button-down shirt that had seen better days but was well pressed. His hands bore the calluses and small scars of manual labor, a stark contrast to the manicured professionals bustling through the building. Robert Harrison was younger than David had expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that suggested competence without arrogance. His office was lined with law books and family photos, comfortable rather than intimidating. "Thank you for coming," Harrison said, gesturing toward a leather chair. "I know this must be confusing, especially given the timing." "What timing?" Harrison consulted a thick file on his desk. According to the trust documents, I was instructed to wait exactly 1 year from the date of your wife's death before making contact. She was very specific about that timeline. David felt a chill of recognition. Sarah had always been deliberate about timing, waiting for the right moment to plant seeds, to have difficult conversations, to make important decisions. Even in death, she was orchestrating events with careful precision. She knew, David said quietly. She knew her parents would try to take the children. Harrison nodded. The trust documents referenced specific circumstances that would trigger its activation. The death of the beneficiary, followed by what she termed financial or emotional coercion by her family members. Her instructions were quite detailed. What kind of trust? Harrison opened a folder and withdrew a document thick with legal language. Mr. Mitchell, your wife established a private foundation worth approximately $200 million. You are the sole trustee, with full discretionary authority over its distribution. The words hit David like a physical blow. He stared at the lawyer, certain he had misheard. That's impossible. Sarah didn't have that kind of money. She inherited it from her maternal grandmother, who had specifically excluded it from the family estate. Your wife kept it separate from her parents' wealth, managed through an independent firm. She spent years planning how to ensure it would be used according to her values rather than theirs. David thought about their modest life, the careful budgeting, the times Sarah had suggested they could afford small luxuries, but chose simplicity instead. She had been sitting on a fortune while they clipped coupons and shopped at thrift stores. Why didn't she tell me? Harrison's expression softened. According to her letter, she wanted you to prove to yourself and to her family that you could provide for your children regardless of financial circumstances. She believed that knowledge of the trust might change how you approached that challenge. As David walked home through the city streets, the lawyer's words echoing in his mind, he realized that Sarah's final gift wasn't the money itself. It was the confidence that came from knowing he had already proven himself worthy of it. 8 months after the eviction, David discovered the photograph while cleaning out a box of miscellaneous items the movers had hastily packed. It was their last family portrait, taken during Emma's 9th birthday party at the Whitmore estate. Sarah sat in the center, radiant despite her illness, with David behind her and the twins on either side. But the photo had been torn jaggedly, angrily separating David from his family. Margaret had kept the portion with Sarah and the children, discarding the piece that contained their father. Emma found him staring at the torn edge, his thumb tracing where his own image had been severed from theirs. "I saved it," she whispered, producing the missing piece from her jewelry box. "I saw Grandma throw it away after the funeral, but I snuck it out of the trash." David's hands shook as he fitted the pieces together. The tear was ugly, dividing the image like a scar, but the family was whole again. Emma had risked her grandmother's anger to preserve their unity, understanding something the adults had forgotten. "Should we tape it?" she asked. "No," David said softly. "Let's frame it just like this. Sometimes the broken places tell the most important part of the story." The photograph took its place on the mantel, a reminder that love could survive even deliberate attempts to destroy it. But it also marked a turning point in David's thinking about the trust fund revelation. For weeks, he had wrestled with Sarah's secret, alternating between gratitude and bewilderment. Now, looking at the torn image, he began to understand her strategy. She had known her family would try to erase him from their children's lives. The money wasn't just inheritance, it was ammunition for a war she had foreseen, but hadn't lived to fight. His old colleague Mark Henderson appeared unexpectedly one Saturday morning, looking uncomfortable but determined. They had taught together for 6 years before Sarah's illness forced David to take extended leave. Mark's presence in their modest neighborhood was jarring, his expensive car and tailored clothes, a stark reminder of the life David had left behind. "I heard about what happened," Mark said, accepting a cup of coffee and looking around the small kitchen with poorly concealed surprise. The whole faculty was shocked when you didn't come back this fall. David had hoped to return to full-time teaching once the twins were settled. But the Whitmores had made it clear that his resignation would be welcomed. They had connections on the school board, and his presence reminded people of their treatment of their own family. "It was time for a change," David said diplomatically. Mark studied him carefully. "You look good, actually. Different, but good. More." He paused, searching for the word. "Substantial, I guess. Like you've been doing real work." David flexed his calloused hands, thinking of the satisfaction that came from building and repairing things with his own effort. "I have been. Listen, there's something you should know. The Hendersons, Margaret's friends from the country club, they've been spreading stories about you not being able to provide for the kids, about how you're living in some kind of slum. The assumption is that you'll eventually see reason and let them take custody." The words hit David like cold water, clarifying thoughts that had been muddy with doubt. The Whitmores weren't just protecting their grandchildren, they were systematically undermining his reputation, creating a narrative that would justify their eventual legal action. "Are you," Mark asked gently, "going to see reason, I mean?" David looked through the window at Jake and Tommy building a fort in the backyard, their laughter carrying on the autumn air. Emma sat nearby, painting their construction project with careful attention to the play of light and shadow. The scene was worth more than anything the Whitmores could offer. "I'm seeing it clearer than I ever have," David replied. Mrs. Patterson's stories about the Depression had become a regular feature of their evening conversations. She spoke matter-of-factly about losing everything twice, once during the stock market crash of 1929, and again when her husband died young, leaving her with 3 children and a mountain of medical debt. "The first time, I thought the world had ended," she told David as they watched the children play in the fading light. "Couldn't understand how people could be happy when everything was falling apart. But the second time, I knew better. Happiness isn't about having everything you want, it's about appreciating what you have while you have it." Her words resonated deeply with David's current situation. The trust fund knowledge sat in his mind like a loaded weapon, offering solutions to every financial concern but threatening to change the essential nature of their rebuilding process. Sarah had chosen to live simply despite her wealth. Perhaps there was wisdom in following her example. Emma's art show at Jefferson Middle School was scheduled for the first Thursday in November. David arranged to leave his construction job early, determined not to miss this milestone in his daughter's recovery. The gymnasium was decorated with student artwork, and parents wandered between displays with the careful pride of people celebrating their children's achievements. Emma's section drew consistent attention. Her paintings had evolved from the dark, chaotic expressions of early grief to more complex compositions that captured both loss and hope. Her centerpiece was a triptych titled Home, 3 panels showing their house on Elm Street in different seasons. Winter showed it stark and weather-beaten, spring revealed new growth and fresh paint, and summer depicted it as a place of warmth and activity. "Your daughter has remarkable talent," said a woman David didn't recognize. She wore the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money. "Have you considered private art instruction?" David felt the familiar pang of limitation, another opportunity his circumstances might prevent him from providing. But before he could respond, Ms. Rodriguez appeared at his elbow. "Emma's been accepted into our advanced art program," she announced proudly. "It's a pilot program funded by a private grant, completely free to qualifying students. She'll work with professional artists twice a week after school." Emma's face lit up with joy, and David felt his chest swell with pride. His daughter was succeeding not because of money or connections, but because of her own talent and determination. The art supplies Sarah had bought were finally being used for their intended purpose. At home that evening, as they celebrated Emma's achievement with ice cream and impromptu art critiques, Jake surprised everyone by revealing his own news. "I made the honor roll," he said casually, producing a certificate from his backpack. "And Mr. Peterson wants me to join the math competition team." David stared at his son, realizing that while he had been focused on providing basic necessities, both children had been quietly excelling. They weren't just surviving their circumstances, they were thriving because of them. "Mom would be proud," Emma said softly, and for the first time since her death, the mention of Sarah brought comfort rather than pain. As David tucked the children into bed that night, he caught sight of the torn photograph on the mantel. The image seemed different somehow, less tragic and more triumphant. They had been broken apart by cruelty and circumstance, but they had chosen to heal together. The trust fund remained his secret, but its existence had given him something more valuable than money: the knowledge that Sarah had believed in his ability to raise their children well, regardless of his financial resources. He had proven her faith justified, one small victory at a time. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows of their modest home, but inside, the Mitchell family was discovering that wealth measured in love and accomplishment was the only currency that truly mattered. The recipe box appeared during a November cleaning session, tucked behind Sarah's winter coats in the bedroom closet. David almost missed it, a simple wooden container, unremarkable except for the careful way Sarah's handwriting covered dozens of index cards inside. But these weren't just recipes. They were love letters disguised as cooking instructions. David's favorite meatloaf. Read one card. "He says it tastes like home. Don't tell him the secret ingredient is love. He thinks it's the Worcestershire sauce." Another card contained instructions for sick day soup. With a note in the margin: "Emma needs extra crackers when she's sad. Jake prefers just the broth. Both need extra hugs while it's cooking." There were holiday menus with detailed timelines, birthday cake recipes with modifications for the twins' preferences, and comfort foods for difficult days. Each card revealed Sarah's intimate knowledge of her family's needs and her determination to provide for them, even in her absence. At the bottom of the box, David found a sealed envelope marked "For difficult decisions." Inside was a letter in Sarah's familiar handwriting. "My dearest David, if you're reading this, you've discovered what I hoped you never would need: a roadmap for the hardest moments of parenthood. I know you're probably angry with me for keeping secrets. I know you're confused about the money and what it means for our family, but I need you to understand something. I never wanted you to change. I fell in love with a man who measured success by the love he gave rather than the wealth he accumulated. The children need that man, especially when the world tries to convince them otherwise. The money is a tool, nothing more. Use it if you must, ignore it if you can, but never let it define who you are. You are enough, exactly as you are. With all my love, Sarah." David read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. Sarah had anticipated his struggle with the inheritance, his concern about maintaining his integrity while accepting her family's wealth. She had known him well enough to understand that the money would feel like both blessing and burden. 1 year had passed since their eviction from the Whitmore estate. David marked the anniversary not with bitterness, but with quiet satisfaction at how far they had come. The house on Elm Street bore little resemblance to the deteriorating structure they had first encountered. Fresh paint brightened the exterior, the garden produced vegetables for their table, and every room showed evidence of careful attention and modest investment. Emma's artistic development had accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. The advanced art program had connected her with Mrs. Chen, a retired professional artist who had taken a special interest in nurturing young talent. Twice a week, Emma stayed after school to work with watercolors, charcoal, and techniques that transformed her natural ability into genuine skill. "She has an unusual gift for emotional expression," Mrs. Chen told David during a parent conference. "Most children her age focus on technical accuracy, but Emma paints feelings. It's quite remarkable." Jake's mathematical aptitude had earned him a place on the regional competition team, where he worked with students from schools across the district. The diversity of the group, children from various economic backgrounds united by intellectual curiosity, had taught him that intelligence was distributed without regard to social status. "I like Jefferson better than my old school," he confided to David one evening. "The kids here aren't weird about money. They care more about whether you're good at stuff." Lisa Martinez had joined the faculty at Jefferson as a fifth-grade teacher, and her presence had complicated David's carefully ordered emotional life. She was intelligent, kind, and completely unimpressed by social distinctions that had once seemed insurmountable. When she laughed at his stories about construction mishaps or asked his opinion about educational policy, David felt himself remembering what it was like to be seen as more than just a struggling single father. "She likes you," Emma observed with the directness that 10-year-olds possessed. "She gets that look when she talks to you." "What look?" "The same one Mom used to get, like you're the most interesting person in the room." David felt a familiar pang of loyalty to Sarah's memory, but it was tempered now by the understanding that grief wasn't meant to be permanent. Sarah's letter had encouraged him to find happiness again, to model for their children that love wasn't a finite resource that could be depleted by sharing it. The persistent phone calls from Robert Harrison had finally worn down David's resistance. The lawyer had been patient but determined, respecting the timeline Sarah had established, while making it clear that legal obligations couldn't be indefinitely postponed. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand this is overwhelming," Harrison said during their second meeting. "But the trust requires annual distributions, and there are tax implications that need immediate attention. Your wife structured this to benefit charitable causes as well as your family, but it needs active management." David learned that Sarah had been quietly supporting various organizations, homeless shelters, literacy programs, and scholarships for underprivileged students. The Meridian Foundation operated in her name, but without public recognition, funding causes she had cared about while avoiding the social obligations that came with visible philanthropy. She was adamant that charity should be private, Harrison explained. She believed that public giving was too often about the giver's reputation rather than the recipient's needs. The scope of Sarah's planning became clearer with each revelation. She had created a legacy that would continue her values long after her death, but she had also ensured that David would be forced to engage with those values actively rather than passively inheriting wealth. Mrs. Patterson's presence in their lives had become indispensable. She appeared for dinner twice a week, shared stories about neighborhood history, and provided the kind of wisdom that only came from surviving multiple life upheavals. The children called her Grandma Pat, and she had embraced the role with enthusiasm. "You know what I like about this family," she said one evening as they watched Emma paint while Jake worked on homework. "You've figured out that happiness isn't about having the perfect life. It's about making the best life you can with what you've got." Her words carried particular weight given David's knowledge of the trust fund. He had what many would consider the perfect solution to every problem: money to buy a better house, provide private education, ensure financial security. But their current life, built through effort and compromise and genuine affection, felt more authentic than any luxury the inheritance could provide. The decision about whether to reveal the trust fund to his children weighed heavily on David's mind. They were old enough to understand the implications, mature enough to handle the responsibility, but young enough that the knowledge might fundamentally alter their developing sense of identity and values. Sarah's recipe box had become a regular source of comfort during decision-making moments. Her practical wisdom about daily life extended to larger questions about parenting and priorities. In the margin of her recipe for chocolate chip cookies, she had written, "The best ingredients can't save a recipe if you rush the process. Good things take time." As winter approached their modest home, David felt a contentment that had nothing to do with material circumstances. They had created something precious, from very little, a family held together by choice rather than obligation, strengthened by adversity rather than weakened by it. The trust fund remained his secret, but its existence had already served its most important purpose, proving to David that he was capable of providing everything his children truly needed, regardless of his financial resources. Sarah's faith in him had been justified not by wealth, but by character, not by what he could buy, but by who he had chosen to become. Standing in their small kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life rebuilt from scratch, David finally understood what Sarah had been trying to teach him. True prosperity wasn't about having money, it was about having the wisdom to know when you were already rich. Robert Harrison arrived at precisely 10 o'clock on a grey December morning, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to contain the weight of revelation. David had finally agreed to a home meeting after months of postponement, partly because the lawyer's persistence had worn down his resistance, and partly because the twins deserved to understand their inheritance before they grew much older. Emma and Jake sat on the living room couch, flanking David like small guardians. They had been told only that a lawyer needed to discuss their mother's will, a conversation David had dreaded but could no longer avoid. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," Harrison began, settling into the chair Mrs. Patterson had donated when their furniture proved insufficient for company. "She spent considerable time planning for your family's future, and she left very specific instructions about when and how you should learn about her arrangements." David watched his children's faces, seeing Sarah's features reflected in their serious expressions. Emma's artistic sensitivity made her particularly attuned to emotional undercurrents, while Jake's protective instincts had him sitting straighter, prepared to defend his family against unknown threats. "What kind of arrangements?" Jake asked, with the directness he had inherited from both parents. Harrison opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked Meridian Foundation Trust. The legal documents inside looked ominous and official, but David noticed Sarah's handwriting on several pages, personal notes that humanized the formal language. "Your mother established a private foundation in her name, worth approximately $200 million, Harrison said gently. "Your father is the primary trustee, and you are both beneficiaries with certain rights and responsibilities." The silence that followed was profound. Emma's eyes widened with a combination of confusion and concern, while Jake's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger. "200 million?" Emma whispered. "That's like being rich. "We are rich," Jake said flatly. "We've been rich this whole time, and Dad didn't tell us." David felt the weight of his children's stares, the accusation implicit in Jake's tone. He had prepared for this moment, but had underestimated how betrayed they might feel by the secrecy. "I only found out a few months ago," David said carefully. "Your mother didn't tell me about it either. She wanted us to prove we could build a good life together before we knew about the money." Harrison reached into the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope addressed to Emma and Jake in Sarah's distinctive handwriting. "She left this for you, with instructions that it should be opened only when you learned about the trust." Emma accepted the letter with trembling hands, and Jake moved closer to read over her shoulder. David watched their faces as they absorbed their mother's words, seeing the progression from confusion to understanding to something approaching awe. "She says she hid the money because she wanted us to learn that happiness doesn't come from having things." Emma read aloud. "She says rich kids sometimes grow up thinking money solves problems instead of learning to solve them themselves." Jake continued reading. "She says Dad is the best person she knows, and she wanted us to see how good he is at taking care of us before we knew about the money that could make it easier." Harrison nodded approvingly. "Your mother was very concerned about the psychological effects of inherited wealth. She studied families who had lost their values to money, and she was determined to prevent that from happening to you." David felt a familiar surge of love and frustration with Sarah's foresight. Even in death, she was orchestrating their emotional development with the precision of a master teacher. "But why now?" Emma asked. "Why tell us now instead of waiting until we're older?" "Because," Harrison explained, "the trust requires active management, and your father needs to make decisions about charitable distributions. Your mother wanted you to be part of those decisions, to learn about responsible stewardship while you're still forming your values." He spread several documents across the coffee table, financial statements, charitable giving reports, and investment summaries that painted a picture of Sarah's quiet philanthropy. The Meridian Foundation had been supporting literacy programs, homeless shelters, and educational scholarships for years, all without public recognition or family knowledge. Mom was secretly helping people? Jake asked, his anger transforming into something closer to pride. She was very private about her giving, Harrison confirmed. She believed that charity should be about helping others, not about making the giver feel important. Emma studied a photograph of children at a summer reading program the foundation had sponsored. These kids got to read books because of Mom? Because of your family's commitment to education and opportunity, Harrison corrected gently. The foundation operates in all your names, and your father has been making decisions about its work, even without realizing it. David looked confused until Harrison explained that several of the programs he had unknowingly encountered, Emma's free art supplies, Jake's math competition funding, even the scholarship that had made Ms. Rodriguez's position possible, had been quietly supported by Sarah's foundation. "She's been taking care of us this whole time," Emma said wonderingly. "Even after she died, she was still making sure we had what we needed." The trust documents revealed the full scope of Sarah's planning. She had structured the inheritance to avoid the pitfalls that destroyed many wealthy families. No immediate access to principal for the children, charitable giving requirements that would teach them about social responsibility, and oversight provisions that would prevent them from becoming entitled or disconnected from reality. "There are conditions," Harrison explained. "Your father must continue working in education or public service. The family must maintain modest living standards, no mansions or private jets. And a significant portion of the annual distributions must go to charitable causes you choose together." Jake frowned as he processed the restrictions. "So we can't just buy whatever we want?" "Your mother wanted you to understand that money is a tool for helping others, not just for making yourselves comfortable," David said, finally finding his voice. "She thought that people who have a lot should share a lot." Emma nodded slowly, her artistic mind already visualizing the possibilities. "We could help kids who don't have art supplies, or families who don't have houses. We could help people like us," Jake added, his protective instincts extending to encompass other struggling families, people who get thrown out by their relatives. Harrison smiled at their responses. "Your mother would be very proud of how you're thinking about this responsibility." David felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Sarah had entrusted to him. The money was substantial enough to solve every practical problem they faced, but it came with expectations that felt both liberating and terrifying. "What if we make mistakes?" he asked. "What if we give money to the wrong causes or fail to help people who need it?" Harrison consulted Sarah's handwritten notes. She anticipated that concern. She wrote, "Mistakes made with good intentions can be corrected. The only real failure would be refusing to try to help others." As the lawyer packed his documents and prepared to leave, he handed David a final envelope marked, "For when you're ready to decide." "Your mother understood that knowledge of the trust would change your family's dynamic," Harrison said. "She wanted you to have time to discuss what this means for your future before making any major decisions." After Harrison left, the three of them sat in silence, processing the revelation that had transformed their understanding of their circumstances. The modest living room looked the same, but everything felt different. "Are we going to move back to a big house?" Emma asked eventually. David looked at his daughter's concerned face and realized she was worried about losing the life they had built together. The house on Elm Street represented more than shelter. It was proof of their resilience, their ability to create happiness from very little. "Do you want to move?" he asked. Both children considered the question seriously before shaking their heads. "I like our house," Jake said. "I like our neighborhood and our friends and our school. And I like that we fixed everything ourselves," Emma added. "It feels more like ours because we worked for it." David felt a profound sense of relief and pride. Sarah's strategy had succeeded. Their children had learned to value effort over ease, community over status, character over wealth. "Then we'll stay," he decided. We'll use the money to help other people, but we'll keep the life we've built." As they cooked dinner together that evening, following one of Sarah's recipes from the wooden box, David marveled at how the revelation of their wealth had somehow made their simple life feel even more precious. They were rich in ways that went far beyond money, and now they had the resources to share that richness with others who needed it most. The sealed envelope from Sarah remained unopened on David's nightstand for 3 days while he wrestled with the implications of their new reality. The children had handled the revelation with remarkable maturity, but he could see them processing the knowledge in different ways. Emma had become more thoughtful about their family's resources, asking careful questions about how much things cost and whether they really needed them. Jake had grown protective of their modest lifestyle, almost defiant in his determination that wealth shouldn't change who they were. On the 4th morning, David finally opened Sarah's letter marked, "For when you're ready to decide." Her handwriting was shakier than usual. This had been written during her final weeks, but her message was clear and purposeful. "My beloved David, by now you know about the money, and you're probably terrified of making the wrong choices. I understand that fear, because I lived with it for years. But I need you to remember something. We never needed the money to be happy. We were rich in all the ways that mattered long before you knew about the trust. The money is simply a tool to extend that richness to others who need it. Don't let it change you. Use it to become more of who you already are. All my love, Sarah." Mrs. Patterson found him reading the letter at the kitchen table, tears streaming down his face. She had taken to arriving each morning with fresh coffee and gentle wisdom, her presence a stabilizing force during their period of adjustment. "Heavy thoughts for a Tuesday morning," she observed, settling into the chair across from him. David handed her the letter, watching her weathered face soften as she read Sarah's words. "She always knew exactly what to say," he said finally. "That's the gift of a woman who loved deeply," Mrs. Patterson replied. She understood that the hardest decisions are often about staying true to yourself when circumstances give you permission to change. The conversation that followed became a watershed moment in David's thinking. Mrs. Patterson had lived through multiple financial upheavals, had seen families destroyed by both poverty and wealth, and her perspective cut through his confusion with surgical precision. "The money isn't the question," she said firmly. "The question is what kind of man you want to be and what kind of father you want your children to remember. Everything else is just details." That afternoon, David walked to Sarah's grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, except for the wind through bare winter trees, and her headstone looked smaller than he remembered. Someone, probably the Whitmores, had placed expensive flowers that seemed incongruous with Sarah's preference for simple wildflowers. He sat on the bench nearby and spoke to her as if she were listening. He told her about the children's achievements, about the house they had repaired together, about the life they had built from love and determination. He told her about his fears regarding the money, his worry that wealth might corrupt the values they had worked so hard to instill. "I don't know how to be rich," he said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to voice his concerns. "I barely figured out how to be poor with dignity." The wind stirred the expensive flowers, and David found himself remembering Sarah's garden behind their first house. She had grown vegetables and herbs they actually used, flowers that attracted butterflies and bees, plants that served purposes beyond mere beauty. Her garden had been about nurturing life, not displaying wealth. The realization that struck him was simple but profound. He could approach the inheritance the same way Sarah had approached her garden, not as decoration, but as a means of nurturing growth in others. Robert Harrison had left detailed information about the Foundation's current charitable work, and David spent the evening reviewing the programs Sarah had quietly supported. The scope was impressive but deeply personal: literacy programs in underserved communities, scholarships for first-generation college students, support for families dealing with medical crises. "She was helping people like us," Emma observed, studying a report about emergency housing assistance. "People who needed help but didn't know where to find it." Jake had become fascinated by the scholarship program. reading profiles of students who had overcome difficult circumstances to pursue education. "This kid's dad died when he was 8, and now he's studying to be a doctor," he said, pointing to a photograph. "The scholarship helped him stay in school." David felt a growing sense of purpose as he understood Sarah's vision. She hadn't simply accumulated wealth, she had created a system for transforming financial resources into human potential. The foundation was her garden, carefully tended to produce lasting benefits for people who needed opportunities more than charity. The practical decisions began to crystallize around this understanding. They would remain in the house on Elm Street, using modest foundation funds to complete necessary repairs and improvements. The children would continue at Jefferson Middle School, but the foundation would quietly support programs that benefited all students. David would return to full-time teaching, knowing that financial security allowed him to focus on education rather than survival. But first, there was a confrontation he could no longer avoid. Word of the inheritance had somehow reached the Whitmores. Harrison suspected a deliberate leak from someone in the legal community who knew both families. Margaret called twice before David answered, her tone a careful mixture of surprise and calculation. "David, darling, I had no idea Sarah had made such arrangements," she said, her voice dripping with newfound sweetness. "We should discuss what this means for the children's future." The assumption in her words was telling that wealth changed everything, that his proven ability to care for his children was somehow irrelevant compared to the number in his bank account. "It doesn't change anything," David replied evenly. "We're happy where we are." "But surely you can see that the children deserve better than Margaret," caught herself before completing the insult. "They deserve every advantage, David. Private schools, cultural opportunities, the society connections that will serve them well in life. They have everything they need," David said firmly. "They have family, education, and a community that values them for who they are, rather than what they have." The conversation ended with Margaret's thinly veiled threat to explore legal options if David continued to make irresponsible decisions about the children's welfare. The call left him shaken but also resolved. The inheritance gave him the resources to fight any custody battle the Whitmores might attempt, but more importantly, it proved that his children were thriving under his care. Lisa Martinez had become a more frequent presence in their lives, though David remained cautious about introducing romantic complications into their carefully balanced family dynamic. She understood his hesitation without taking offense, supporting his priorities while making her own feelings gently clear. "You're overthinking this," she said one evening as they watched the children work on homework at the kitchen table. "They're not fragile. They're not going to shatter if they see their father happy." Her words echoed Mrs. Patterson's frequent observations about the healing power of joy. Sarah's memory would always be precious, but it didn't require David to remain perpetually in mourning. The inheritance had given him financial freedom, but emotional freedom was a choice he had to make for himself. Emma's latest painting depicted their family of 3 standing in front of their house, but she had added a 4th figure, a translucent woman with Sarah's blonde hair and green eyes, positioned protectively behind them like a guardian angel. The image was both heartbreaking and comforting, showing how the children had integrated their mother's death into their understanding of family continuity. "She's still taking care of us," Emma explained when David studied the painting, "just in a different way now." Jake had begun asking questions about investment strategy and charitable giving, his mathematical mind engaged by the complexity of managing substantial resources responsibly. "If we give away too much too fast, we won't be able to help people for very long," he reasoned. "But if we don't give away enough, we're not really helping as many people as we could." His 10-year-old analysis of sustainable philanthropy impressed David and confirmed Sarah's wisdom in exposing the children to these concepts early. They were learning to think about wealth as a responsibility rather than a privilege, understanding that having money meant having the power to improve other people's lives. The final piece of Sarah's plan became clear when Harrison delivered the Foundation's annual report. Hidden among the financial statements and program summaries was a section titled Legacy Giving, a fund Sarah had established specifically for David to use in honoring her memory. The instructions were simple: find a cause that would make her proud and invest in it with the same love and attention she had brought to their family. Standing in their small kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life rebuilt through determination and grace, David finally understood what Sarah had been preparing him for. The inheritance wasn't about changing their circumstances, it was about expanding their capacity to create the kind of positive change they had experienced in their own lives. He was ready to face the Whitmores not as a supplicant seeking approval, but as a man who had proven his worth through action rather than wealth. He was ready to show them that true family was built through love and commitment, not financial advantage. Most importantly, he was ready to teach his children that the greatest inheritance Sarah had left them wasn't money. It was the example of how to live with purpose, integrity, and compassion for others who needed help finding their way home. The Whitmore estate looked exactly as David remembered: imposing wrought-iron gates, manicured grounds, and the kind of old-money elegance that whispered of inherited privilege rather than earned success. But as he walked up the circular driveway with Emma and Jake beside him, David felt none of the intimidation that had once made him question his worth. The months of rebuilding their lives had given him something more valuable than wealth: unshakable confidence in his identity as a father and provider. Margaret answered the door herself, dressed in the understated cashmere and pearls that served as armor for women of her social standing. Her smile was carefully calibrated, warm enough to suggest reconciliation, but restrained enough to maintain the upper hand she assumed she still possessed. "David, children, how wonderful to see you," she said, ushering them into the marble foyer where the family portrait hung in its place of honor. The massive oil painting depicted 4 generations of Whitmores in formal poses, their expressions radiating the confidence that came from never doubting their place in the world. David had been excluded from every family photograph during his marriage to Sarah, a deliberate erasure that had once wounded him deeply, but now seemed merely petty. "Grandmother," Emma said politely, allowing herself to be briefly hugged. Jake maintained more distance, his protective instincts still sharp from their months of rejection. Charles emerged from his study, carrying the leather folder that suggested this meeting was business rather than social. His handshake was firm but perfunctory, his eyes already calculating how David's newfound wealth might benefit the family's broader interests. "Shall we sit in the library?" Margaret suggested, leading them toward a room lined with leather-bound books that looked more decorative than functional. "I thought we could discuss the children's future now that circumstances have changed." The assumption embedded in her words that money automatically changed everything revealed how completely the Whitmores misunderstood both David's character and their daughter's intentions. They had spent a year treating him as an unworthy charity case, and now they expected financial revelation to erase that humiliation through mutual interest in social advancement. "Circumstances haven't changed," David said quietly, settling into a chair that had once intimidated him but now felt merely expensive. "We're the same people we were yesterday." Charles consulted his folder with the precision of someone accustomed to controlling family dynamics through documentation. "David, let's be practical. The children are now beneficiaries of substantial wealth. They need proper guidance about social responsibilities, investment strategies, philanthropic traditions. They need their father," Jake interrupted, his voice carrying the same steel that had helped him defend their family during the darkest months. "They need the person who actually takes care of them." Margaret's expression tightened at this challenge to adult authority, but she attempted to maintain her diplomatic facade. "Of course, darling, no one is suggesting otherwise. But surely you can see that private education would better prepare you for managing such significant resources." "We're not leaving our school," Emma said firmly. "Our friends are there. Our teachers believe in us. Why would we leave people who care about us?" David watched his children defend their choices with articulate passion and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money. They had learned to value authentic relationships over social advantages, to measure worth by character rather than wealth. Because, Charles said, with the patience of someone explaining obvious truths to children, you now have obligations to your family name, to the foundation your mother established, to the community that will expect certain standards. What community? David asked, his voice remaining calm despite the anger building in his chest. The community that threw us out when we needed support? The community that assumed I couldn't provide for my children because I'm a teacher rather than a trust fund recipient? The silence that followed was electric with tension. Margaret and Charles exchanged glances that suggested this conversation wasn't proceeding according to their carefully planned script. We were grieving, Margaret said finally, her tone attempting conciliation. We all made mistakes during a difficult time, but now we have an opportunity to heal our family, to give the children the advantages Sarah would have wanted. Sarah wanted them to understand that wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege, David interrupted. She wanted them to learn empathy, humility, and the value of helping others. Those aren't lessons you learn in private academies or country clubs. Charles leaned forward, his diplomatic mask slipping to reveal the calculation underneath. David, you're being naive. Money changes everything, whether you acknowledge it or not. The children will be targeted by people who want to exploit their wealth, judged by standards you don't understand, expected to navigate social situations you can't prepare them for. They'll be fine, David said with quiet certainty, because they've learned that their worth isn't determined by other people's opinions or expectations. They've learned that family is built through love and commitment, not financial advantage. Emma reached for David's hand, her small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones in a gesture that spoke louder than any argument. Jake moved closer to his father's side, presenting a united front that no amount of money could fracture. Margaret stared at the three of them, father and children bound together by shared struggle and mutual devotion, and something flickered in her expression. For a moment, David glimpsed the grief she had been hiding behind social maneuvering, the desperate attempt to maintain connection to her deceased daughter through control of her grandchildren. The revelation came not through grand gesture but through quiet observation. Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked as she watched Emma sketch in a notebook. She had brought a simple drawing of their house on Elm Street, surrounded by the garden they had planted together. The image was unpretentious but filled with love, showing a home that valued growth over grandeur. She draws, like Sarah did, Margaret whispered, her voice catching on unexpected emotion, always finding beauty in simple things. David realized that the Whitmores' attempts to reclaim their grandchildren weren't entirely about social status or family pride. They were grieving parents, desperate to maintain connection to their daughter through the only pieces of her that remained. Their methods had been controlling and hurtful, but their underlying motivation was heartbreakingly human. Sarah learned to see beauty in simple things because she chose to, David said gently. She could have lived surrounded by expensive possessions, but she preferred a garden she could tend with her own hands, a home where love mattered more than luxury. Charles set down his folder, the legal documents suddenly seeming less important than the conversation at hand. We just want what's best for them, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. We want to honor Sarah's memory by ensuring they have every opportunity. The best thing for them is stability, Jake said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that came from experiencing both loss and recovery. We've been through enough changes. We don't want to change anymore. Emma looked up from her drawing to address her grandparents directly. We know you love us, but Daddy loves us too, and he's been taking good care of us. We're happy where we are. The simple statement carried more power than any legal argument or financial negotiation. These children had found healing and security with their father, had thrived in circumstances the Whitmores had dismissed as inadequate. Their contentment was visible in their confidence, their artistic and academic achievements, their ability to speak their truth without fear. David reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope. "There's something you should see," he said, handing Margaret photographs from Emma's recent art show. "These are some of the paintings Emma created this year." Margaret's hands trembled as she studied the images' works that chronicled their family's journey from devastation to renewal. The progression was remarkable. Early pieces full of dark chaos, gradually giving way to compositions that showed healing, growth, and hope. The final painting in the series depicted their modest house glowing with warm light, surrounded by neighbors and friends who had become chosen family. "She's extraordinary," Margaret breathed, her professional art appreciation overriding her emotional defenses. "These show such sophistication, such emotional depth." She learned to express her feelings through art because she felt safe to have feelings, David explained, because she knew that our love wasn't conditional on her being perfect or impressive. She could be sad, angry, confused, hopeful, and we would still be her family. Charles studied a photograph of Jake receiving his honor roll certificate, surrounded by classmates from diverse backgrounds who clearly respected and liked him. "He looks confident," he observed, as if surprised that a child could thrive outside exclusive social circles. He learned that his worth comes from his character and effort, not from his family's reputation or bank account, David said. "He's proud of what he's accomplished because he earned it himself." The house deed David withdrew from the envelope was modest, a simple document transferring ownership of a 3-bedroom home on Maple Street, one neighborhood over from Elm Street but significantly nicer. The mortgage had been paid in full through the foundation, ensuring stability while maintaining the community connections that had become essential to their healing. "We're not rejecting wealth," David explained, as Margaret examined the deed. "We're using it responsibly. The children will have college funds, financial security, and the resources to pursue their dreams. But they'll also understand that money is a tool for helping others, not just for personal comfort." He showed them the Foundation's updated mission statement, written with input from Emma and Jake. The document outlined their commitment to supporting families in crisis, educational opportunities for underserved communities, and arts programs that gave children creative outlets during difficult times. "Sarah would be proud of this," Charles said quietly. Reading about scholarship programs that would help students like David had once been talented but unable to afford elite education without assistance. "She planned it this way," David replied. "She wanted the children to learn about philanthropy by participating in it, to understand that privilege comes with responsibility." Margaret's composure finally broke completely as she understood what she had almost lost through her attempts to control rather than connect. "We were so afraid of losing them that we nearly drove them away," she whispered, "just like we did with Sarah." The admission hung in the air between them, a recognition that their daughter had chosen simplicity, partly as rebellion against expectations that valued appearance over authenticity. Sarah's marriage to David hadn't been just about love. It had been about rejecting the shallow priorities that had characterized her upbringing. "You haven't lost them," David said gently, "but you have to love them as they are, not as you think they should be. You have to respect the life we've built together instead of trying to replace it with something you consider better." Emma approached her grandmother tentatively, offering her sketchbook. "Would you like to see more of my drawings? I've been painting the people who helped us when we needed help. Mrs. Patterson, Ms. Rodriguez, the neighbors who became our friends." As Margaret turned the pages, tears streaming down her face, she saw her granddaughter's world through artistic eyes that had learned to recognize beauty in kindness rather than luxury. The portraits were loving tributes to ordinary people who had shown extraordinary compassion. "They're beautiful," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've captured something special in each face, the goodness that shines through when people care about others." Jake moved to stand beside his sister, his protective stance softening as he watched his grandparents genuinely engage with their work and achievements. "We could show you our school sometime," he offered cautiously, "if you want to see where we're learning and who our friends are." The gesture was small but significant, an invitation to be part of their real lives, rather than demanding they conform to different expectations. It represented the kind of relationship Sarah had always hoped for, one based on mutual respect and genuine interest, rather than social obligation. Charles nodded slowly, understanding that acceptance of their choices was the price of maintaining family connection. "We'd like that very much," he said. "And perhaps you could tell us more about the Foundation's work. Your father and Sarah have created something remarkable." As they prepared to leave, Margaret handed Emma a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple gold locket containing a photograph of Sarah as a child, sitting in a garden much like the one she would later create with David. "She always preferred flowers she could pick and give away," Margaret said softly. "Even as a little girl, she understood that the best things in life were meant to be shared." The drive home was quiet but peaceful. David glanced in the rearview mirror at his children, seeing the satisfaction that came from standing firm in their values while remaining open to reconciliation. They had learned to hold their ground without hardening their hearts, a lesson that would serve them well in navigating future challenges. "Are we going to see them more often now?" Emma asked as they pulled into their driveway. "If they can accept us as we are," David replied. "Family relationships have to be based on respect, not control." Jake unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't immediately get out of the car. "Dad, I'm glad we didn't let them change our minds about our life. What we have is pretty good." David looked at their modest house, where Mrs. Patterson was visible through the kitchen window preparing dinner, where the garden showed signs of their careful tending, where every improvement represented their shared effort and love. "Yes," he agreed, feeling the deep contentment that came from knowing he had honored both Sarah's memory and her hopes for their family. "What we have is very good indeed." 2 years later, Emma's painting hung in the place of honor above their fireplace, a family portrait unlike any traditional representation. David stood in the center, his arms around Emma and Jake, but their mother's presence was unmistakable. Sarah appeared as a figure of light behind them, her hands resting protectively on their shoulders, her expression radiating the love that transcended death. Emma had titled the piece "Complete," and David understood why every time he looked at it. The house on Maple Street had become everything their first home on Elm Street had promised to be. Comfortable without being ostentatious, it provided space for the children to grow while maintaining the sense of community that had been essential to their healing. Mrs. Patterson lived just around the corner now, having moved to a senior community that kept her close to the family she had adopted. She still appeared for dinner twice a week, regaling them with stories and dispensing wisdom that had guided 3 generations through life's complexities. Emma's artistic development had exceeded everyone's expectations. Her work was now displayed in a small gallery downtown, with proceeds supporting the Foundation's arts education programs. She had learned to paint not just with technical skill, but with emotional intelligence that touched viewers deeply. Her latest series, Families, depicted various configurations of love and support: single parents, blended families, chosen families, elderly neighbors caring for young children. Each painting celebrated the truth that family was defined by devotion rather than biology. "I want people to see that love comes in lots of different shapes," she explained to the local newspaper reporter who interviewed her about the gallery showing. "My mom taught me that the most important thing isn't what your family looks like, but how much you care about each other." Jake's mathematical aptitude had earned him acceptance to a prestigious summer program at the State University, where he would study advanced calculus and financial modeling. But he had chosen to spend half his summer working with the Foundation's scholarship recipients, helping younger students understand that academic achievement was possible regardless of economic circumstances. "I want to help kids who think they're not smart enough for college because their families don't have money," he told David as they reviewed applications for the Foundation's newest education initiative. I want them to know that being poor doesn't mean being stupid, and being rich doesn't make you better than anyone else. David had returned to full-time teaching at Jefferson Middle School, where his experience with both struggle and recovery had made him a more empathetic and effective educator. His students trusted him because he understood what it meant to face challenges that seemed insurmountable, to find strength in unexpected places, to build hope from very little. The foundation now supported 17 different programs across the region, from emergency housing assistance to literacy tutoring to college scholarships. David, Emma, and Jake met monthly to review applications and choose recipients, a process that had taught the children more about social responsibility than any textbook could provide. "The best part isn't giving away the money," Jake observed during one of their meetings. "It's seeing what people do with the opportunities. It's like planting seeds and watching them grow into things you never expected." Lisa Martinez had become a permanent part of their lives through a courtship so gradual that the children barely noticed the transition from friendship to love. She understood that Sarah's memory would always be cherished, that David's heart was large enough to honor the past while embracing the future. Her own warmth and intelligence had earned the children's affection without threatening their loyalty to their mother. "She makes Dad smile in a different way," Emma confided to Mrs. Patterson during one of their private art sessions. "Not like he's remembering being happy, but like he's actually happy right now." The wedding was small and informal, held in their backyard garden with only close friends and family in attendance. Margaret and Charles were there, having gradually learned to value their grandchildren's happiness over their own expectations. They had discovered that love freely given was more precious than control forcibly maintained. Margaret had become particularly invested in Emma's artistic development, not as a way of reshaping her granddaughter, but as a means of understanding the sensitivity and perception that had characterized Sarah's approach to life. "You see the world the way your mother did," she told Emma during a quiet moment at the reception, "with eyes that look for beauty and hearts that look for good." Charles had surprised everyone by taking genuine interest in the Foundation's work, offering business expertise without attempting to dictate policy. His corporate connections had proven valuable for expanding scholarship programs, but he had learned to contribute rather than control. "I spent so many years thinking that money was the most important thing I could give my family," he admitted to David as they watched the children play in the evening light. "I forgot that time and attention were worth more than any inheritance." The Meridian Foundation had grown beyond Sarah's original vision while maintaining her core values. David served as executive director, but the children's input shaped every major decision. They had learned to think globally while acting locally, to balance compassion with practicality, to measure success by lives improved rather than dollars distributed. Emma's latest project involved teaching art classes to children in foster care, helping them express emotions they couldn't yet verbalize. Jake volunteered at the local food bank, where his mathematical skills helped optimize distribution, while his natural empathy ensured that clients felt respected rather than pitied. "Mom would love seeing how much we help people," Emma said one evening as they reviewed thank you letters from scholarship recipients. "She always said the best thing about having enough was being able to make sure other people had enough too." David nodded, remembering Sarah's quiet generosity long before he knew about the trust fund. She had given anonymously to families in need, had tutored struggling students without payment, had seen charity as privilege rather than obligation. The foundation was simply an extension of values she had lived every day. Standing in their garden as sunset painted the sky in gentle pastels, David reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. The eviction that had seemed like catastrophe had become the catalyst for discovering their true strength. The wealth that might have corrupted had instead become a tool for creating positive change. Sarah's ring still rested in his dresser drawer, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder of love that had been wise enough to plan for a future it wouldn't see. Her greatest gift hadn't been the money, It had been the faith that her family would use whatever resources they possessed to make the world a little better. As Emma painted by the window and Jake worked on scholarship essays and Lisa prepared dinner with comfortable efficiency, David understood that they had achieved something rare, a life of purpose built on love, sustained by integrity, and shared with others who needed hope. They were, in every way that mattered, completely rich.